Somewhere beneath the surf line of Los Angeles, past the palm trees and the postcard sunsets, the Pacific Ocean is keeping secrets. For more than a century, this stretch of Southern California coastline has been the backdrop for the movie industry's biggest dreams, and underneath the waves lies the wreckage of some of its strangest, darkest, and most forgotten true stories. Sunken. Ships built for the silver screen. A neighborhood that slid, house by house, into the sea. A toxic graveyard hidden in the deep water between the mainland and Catalina Island. And a buried city, swallowed not by water but by sand, that Hollywood tried to erase from history altogether. Using historical records, sonar surveys, and the work of divers and archaeologists who have spent decades piecing this story together, we're about to drain the ocean on the industry that built modern entertainment and expose what it left behind. Our first stop is a stretch of coastline just south of the city, in the exclusive hillside community of Palos Verdes. Today, these bluffs are lined with mansions and golf courses, million-dollar views stacked one on top of another above the water. But drop below the surface, just off these cliffs, the seafloor tells a very different story, littered with the twisted steel of ships that never should have ended up here at all. On a foggy morning in March of 1961, a freighter called the Dominator was working its way down the coast toward the port of Los Angeles, hauling a cargo of wheat and beef from Vancouver. Fog on this stretch of coast has claimed hundreds of vessels over the decades, and the Dominator became one more name on that list. Blind in the mist, her crew never saw the rocky shoreline of the Palos Verdes Peninsula until it was already too late. The ship ran hard aground, her hull grinding into the rock shelf as heavy surf pounded her sides. The Coast Guard tried and failed to pull her free. Conditions were too dangerous, the swells too large, and eventually the order was given to abandon ship. Every crew member made it off alive, but the Dominator herself was left to the ocean. More than 60 years later, drained of the fog and the waves that hide her, her rusted hull is still visible today, wedged into the same rocks that ended her voyage. A stark reminder that even in one of the most photographed coastlines on Earth, the sea still calls the final shot. The Dominator wasn't sailing blind by accident. This entire section of coastline, stretching from Point Conception down through the Channel Islands and past Los Angeles, has earned a grim nickname among mariners, a graveyard on par with anything on the Atlantic seaboard. Maritime historians estimate that more than 700 ships and aircraft have been lost in these waters, victims of thick coastal fog, sudden northwest winds, and the treacherous currents that swirl around the offshore Channel Islands. If we drain the water around Anacapa Island, one of the northernmost of these islands, we find the remains of the Winfield Scott, a steamship that met its end in 1853 while carrying more than 300 passengers and roughly $1 million in gold rush-era treasure from San Francisco toward Panama. Her captain, trying to shave time off the journey, steered through the Santa Barbara Channel in dense morning fog and drove the ship straight into a rock formation off Anacapa at full speed, tearing 2 holes through the bow. Everyone survived, stranded on the island for nearly a week before rescue arrived. But the ship, and much of that fortune in gold, went down with her. Treasure hunters have picked at her bones in the decades since, but she remains there today, one wreck among more than 100 scattered across the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary alone, a reminder that Hollywood's glamorous coastline has always had teeth. Not every ship at the bottom of these waters sank by accident. Some were sent there on purpose, sacrificed for the cameras. Long before computer-generated effects could conjure a burning ship out of thin air, filmmakers in the silent era needed the real thing, and they were willing to destroy genuine vessels to get it. In 1926, the production team behind the naval epic Old Ironsides needed a ship to burn and sink on camera for dramatic effect. Rather than fake it, they took a real barkentine, the SN Castle, out into Catalina Harbor on Santa Catalina Island, set her ablaze, and let her go down for real, capturing raw, unscripted footage of an actual ship dying in actual water. It's a jarring thing to picture today, an industry so hungry for authenticity that it was willing to sink real ships rather than fake the shot. But it captures something essential about how far early Hollywood was willing to go in pursuit of spectacle. Her remains still rest on the harbor floor at Catalina, a piece of movie history that very few visitors snorkeling or diving nearby even realize they're swimming over. Catalina Island itself deserves a closer look, because for most of the 20th century, this small island 22 miles off the coast of Los Angeles was essentially Hollywood's private backlot floating in the Pacific. Its rugged coves, clear water, and dramatic cliffs made it the go-to stand-in for the South Pacific, the Mediterranean, and dozens of other exotic locations that studios couldn't afford to actually visit. Production crews ferried cameras, costumes, and entire casts out to the island for decades, and in the process, the waters around Catalina quietly accumulated a scattering of wrecks tied directly to the film industry. Sunken vessels used as props, damaged sets that were simply pushed off the pier when a chute wrapped, and genuine maritime accidents involving the ferries and support boats that kept production supplied. If you drain the clear turquoise water around Casino Point today, a popular dive park on the island, you can see some of that legacy up close. An old schooner that ran aground near the point generations ago, now encrusted with the same golden Garibaldi fish that have made these waters famous among divers, swimming in and out of hull sections that once carried film crews and props between takes. But Catalina's waters hide something far darker than old movie props, something that has nothing to do with glamour and everything to do with what an industry-driven coastline was willing to hide beneath the surface once the cameras stopped rolling. Between Catalina Island and the Palos Verdes Peninsula lies a stretch of deep ocean basin that, for decades, served as one of the largest chemical dumping grounds on the west coast. From the late 1940s through the early 1970s, a chemical company just inland in Torrance was producing massive quantities of the pesticide DDT, at the time the largest DDT manufacturer in the entire country. Rather than properly dispose of the toxic waste generated by that production, the company funneled much of it directly into the Los Angeles County sewer system, which emptied straight into the ocean off White Point on the Palos Verdes shelf. The rest was loaded into steel barrels, hauled by barge 10 to 15 miles offshore, and dumped, sometimes deliberately punctured first to make sure they would sink faster. The scale of the problem is one that modern science is still struggling to address. Because the dump site sits roughly half a mile beneath the surface, far deeper than most remediation equipment was ever designed to reach, researchers have concluded that hauling the barrels back up may actually do more harm than leaving them in place, since disturbing the seafloor risks releasing decades of settled contamination back into the water column all at once. For now, the official response has largely been to monitor the site rather than attempt to clean up, tracking contamination levels in local fish and marine mammals, while the barrels continue their slow, silent decay on the ocean floor. California sea lions living along this same stretch of coast have been found with DDT concentrations high enough to correlate with unusually elevated cancer rates, a disease exceptionally rare in wild animal populations anywhere else on the planet. It's a sobering data point buried in scientific journals rather than movie trailers, but it belongs in the same story as every sunken ship along this coast. Proof that the industry which built its fortune on selling illusions left behind consequences that were entirely uncomfortably real. Just a few miles up the coast from the DDT dump site and the wreck of the Dominator, another piece of this coastline's entertainment history has its own quiet, half-forgotten ending beneath the waves. In the 1950s, developers built an ambitious oceanarium directly into the cliffs of the Palos Verdes Peninsula, one of the first marine parks of its kind anywhere in the country, and drawing crowds eager to see killer whales, dolphins, and sea lions performing in specially built seaside tanks with the Pacific itself as a backdrop. For decades, it thrived as both a tourist attraction and, fittingly for this stretch of coastline, an occasional filming location, its dramatic cliffside pools appearing in television productions, looking for an easy stand-in for an exotic marine setting. But changing attitudes toward marine mammal captivity, combined with the rising popularity of larger competing parks elsewhere in the state, eventually drained the crowds away for good, and the park closed its gates in the mid-1980s. Much of the original structure was later demolished, but remnants of its old sea-level tanks and pilings can still be found along the base of the cliffs. At low tide, concrete foundations slowly being reclaimed by the same ocean that once filled them, a quieter and less dramatic kind of disappearance than a shipwreck. But part of the same pattern, an industry built directly at the water's edge, eventually surrendering its structures back to the sea. Perhaps the strangest secret on this entire stretch of coast isn't hidden underwater at all, but it belongs in this story all the same, because it represents an industry burying its own history so thoroughly that it took 60 years and a small army of dedicated searchers to find it again. In 1923, one of Hollywood's most ambitious directors needed a desert. He was preparing to shoot an enormous biblical epic centered on the story of Moses, and he wanted a vast, otherworldly landscape to double for ancient Egypt. Rather than travel overseas, he chose a remote, windswept stretch of sand dunes roughly 150 miles north of Los Angeles, near the small farming town of Guadalupe. What he built there was almost unimaginable by the standards of the era. A temple complex nearly 800 feet wide, 21 massive plaster sphinxes, each weighing tons, 4 towering statues of an Egyptian pharaoh standing several stories tall, and an entire tent city to house the thousands of workers and cast members required to bring it all to life. More than 1,500 carpenters worked around the clock. The production budget ballooned so far out of control that the studio funding it tried to shut the whole thing down by telegram, and the director refused, taking out a personal loan and forfeiting his own share of the film's profits just to keep building. When filming finally wrapped, the director faced a strange practical problem. What do you do with an entire ancient city built out of wood, plaster, and thousands of tons of material, sitting in the middle of nowhere, far too expensive to transport back to Los Angeles? According to the story that has circulated in Hollywood ever since, rather than let a rival production scavenge the set or leave it to rot in full public view, he made the decision to bury it. Bulldozers pushed the sphinxes, the temple walls, and the towering statues into a trench dug into the dunes. The desert sand did the rest, slowly swallowing the entire set until almost nothing remained visible above the surface. The director himself reportedly joked that if archaeologists ever dug it up 1,000 years from now, he hoped they wouldn't rush to announce that ancient Egyptian civilization had somehow extended all the way to the California coast. For 60 years, the buried city became little more than a rumor passed between film students and local old-timers, a piece of Hollywood folklore that seemed almost too strange to be true. That changed in the early 1980s when a young filmmaker heard the story secondhand and became obsessed with proving it. Following a cryptic clue buried in the original director's own memoir, he tracked down locals in Guadalupe who still remembered the production from their childhoods, and in 1983, following a particularly stormy winter that had shifted the dunes, he found it. Acres of faux Egyptian statuary poking up out of the sand, exactly where the old stories said it would be. What followed was a decades-long excavation effort led by professional archaeologists working painstakingly to unearth and preserve fragile plaster sphinxes that had spent the better part of a century buried under shifting desert sand. If you could drain away that sand the same way we've been draining the ocean along this coast, you'd find a lost city hiding in plain sight. Fragments of towering statues, faux Egyptian coins used as movie props, syrup bottles and tobacco tins left behind by cast and crew, and the skeletal remains of one of the most expensive and audacious film sets ever constructed, entombed by the very industry that built it. Pieces of that lost city are now on public display at a small museum near the dunes, giving visitors a chance to see for the first time in a century exactly what Hollywood once tried so hard to make disappear. Back along the immediate Los Angeles coastline, there's one more site that belongs in any accounting of this region's hidden secrets. And unlike everything else in this story, it isn't a shipwreck or a movie prop. It's an entire neighborhood. In the 1920s, a developer looked out at the dramatic ocean bluffs of Point Fermin at the southern tip of the San Pedro Peninsula and saw an opportunity. Build charming beachside bungalows along the cliff edge, sell the spectacular unobstructed ocean views, and cash in on Southern California's booming real estate market. Homes went up, streets were paved, a trolley line was extended to serve the new community. Families moved in, drawn by sunsets that stretched unbroken across the Pacific. What nobody involved in the development had done, according to the geological investigations that followed, was any serious study of what was actually holding that cliff together. The ground began to fail in January of 1929. It started small, pipes cracking for no obvious reason, a waterline rupturing beneath a hotel, a hairline fissure appearing in the pavement outside a row of homes. Within months, engineers determined that the Earth itself was on the move, sliding slowly but steadily toward the ocean, at a rate that eventually reached 11 inches a day, an almost unbelievable pace for a geological event, usually measured in inches per year, not per day. A geology professor from Caltech warned the city that the ground beneath these homes had shifted enough to rip apart building foundations and tear open buried utility lines, and that any structure built on it was no longer safe. Streets buckled, sidewalks split apart. An earthquake later that same year accelerated the collapse even further. Remarkably, no one was killed in the initial slide. The movement was slow enough that residents were evacuated and most of the homes were physically relocated to safer ground before the worst of the collapse. But 2 houses, along with a section of the coastal road, a stretch of a trolley track, and a chunk of the adjacent public park, were not so lucky. Over the following decades, as the land continued its slow-motion slide, close to 40,000 square feet of California real estate simply slipped away into the Pacific Ocean, taking the physical evidence of an entire vanished neighborhood down with it. Today, locals call the site Sunken City. And even though it's officially closed to the public and fenced off behind iron railings, it has become one of the most quietly famous urban ruins in the country. Its cracked and tilted concrete slabs rising out of the hillside like the exposed bones of a buried civilization. If we drain away the decades and imagine the site as it looked before, the collapse. Rows of cheerful bungalows sat exactly where a jagged sunken staircase to nowhere now leads down toward crashing surf. It's a stark, almost eerie contrast. A neighborhood built to showcase the very ocean that eventually swallowed it. A fitting final image for a coastline that has spent a century building its fortunes and its fantasies right at the water's edge, never quite reckoning with how much the ocean itself was owed. Taken together, these sites tell a story that Hollywood's glossy public image rarely acknowledges. The same stretch of California coastline that gave the world its dream factory, its premieres, its beaches full of movie stars and studio backlots, has also quietly absorbed the industry's wreckage, its waste, its accidents, and its buried failures for more than a century. A freighter still rusting on the rocks where fog outsmarted her crew. A burned hull resting in a harbor once chosen for its cinematic beauty. Tens of thousands of leaking barrels hidden in the dark water between the mainland and the island that so many films used as a stand-in for paradise. A deadly tanker explosion that tore through a working harbor just miles from the studio. Lots. A city buried on purpose in sand instead of water, so thoroughly forgotten that it had to be rediscovered by accident. And an entire beachside neighborhood, built to sell an ocean view, ultimately consumed by the very ocean it was designed to showcase. None of these stories made it into the highlight reels or the studio publicity photos. They exist instead in shipping logs, geological survey reports, sonar scans, and the patient work of divers, archaeologists, and local historians who refuse to let this coastline's stranger history simply wash away. When you drain the water, and in one case the sand from along this famous stretch of California coast, what's left behind isn't a story about glamour at all. It's a story about what an industry built on illusion leaves behind when the cameras finally stop rolling. Real wreckage, real consequences, and real history sitting quietly beneath the surface, waiting for someone to come looking. And that, in the end, may be the most Hollywood secret of all. An industry built entirely on spectacle, on convincing audiences that anything is possible with the right camera angle and the right amount of nerve, has spent 100 years generating a very real, very physical trail of evidence just beneath the surface of the water it's so often used as a backdrop. The fog that hid the Dominator from our own crew still rolls in most mornings. The barrels off Catalina are still down there, some of them still leaking. The sand at Guadalupe is still shifting, threatening to either bury the last remnants of that lost city forever or reveal whatever pieces of it remain unfound. And the cliffs at Point Fermin are, by most accounts, still moving, if only by fractions of an inch a year now instead of 11 inches a day. The story this coastline has been quietly telling for a century isn't finished. It's simply waiting, the way the ocean always does, for the tide to pull back just far enough to show what's really been down there all along.